So welcome everyone. I think I'm just going to crack on and then those who join late can catch up a bit later. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Nikki Duplessis. I'm the Comms and Stakeholder Engagement Lead on this project, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. So during this webinar, our speakers today will be outlining a component indicator under Target 16 of the GBF, which is a tool that tracks the environmental impacts of global consumption and was jointly developed by ourselves at the JNCC and the Stockholm Environment Institute at the University of York under contract to DEFRA. We also had additional support from Trace and the GCRF Trade Hub. So just to give you an idea of who is in the room today, we've just going to launch a quick poll. If you could just bear with us while we pop that up. Yeah, so if you could just tell us what type of organization you're from when it loads, and click submit. It should share. Yeah, so see we're getting quite a few from the public sector. That's great. And yeah, research institutions, intergovernmental organizations, quite a widespread. That's great to see. So for those of you who don't know who we are at the JNCC, Maddie, if you could go to the next slide. So we are the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, which is a public body that advises governments and work in partnership with business and society. And we are dedicated to providing high quality evidence and turning this evidence into action in the for people, nature and planet, both within the UK and internationally. We first started working in the area of sustainable consumption about a decade ago, and since then have grown into a full team. Our speakers today are, in order of appearance, Ellie Wood, who is an ecosystem analyst at JNCC, who's been leading on the indicated data updates, as well as Maddie Harris, who's a senior evidence specialist who's taken the indicator from just an idea in 2018 to one of international significance. Ellie will be outlining the background, how to use the dashboard, and as well as use the indicator for national reporting, whilst Maddie will highlight the methods, use cases, some future work, and as well as put it in the context with other metrics. And all of this will be done through a GBF lens. At the end, there will be some time for questions, so please drop your questions in the Q&A at the top of the screen rather than in the chat box. And please note that this is an open call, so please be mindful of what you put in the Q&A. If you'd like to discuss anything of a sensitive nature with us, please do get in touch with us afterwards. Over to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Nikki, for that great introduction. So jumping straight into what we want to talk about today, it's well evidenced that the biggest cause of biodiversity loss is land use change, and that the biggest driver of land use change is expanding commodity production, particularly in the agricultural sector. Intensifying production can also put other pressures such as water stress and pollution on biodiversity. And of course, the reason we're producing commodities on this land in the first place is to support human consumption. And it's a two-way relationship. So many ecosystem services support the production of commodities, thereby ensuring resource security for consumers all over the world and stability for producers. But biodiversity loss and land use change can lead to a loss of these vital ecosystem services, leading to resource insecurity and economic instability. This is a complex problem to understand. Many countries consume a lot from overseas, but don't have a very good idea of where those commodities come from or the impacts of production in the environments commodities are produced in. To complicate things further, goods often travel through several countries before reaching their final destination, and the product at the end of the supply chain can look very different to its component raw materials. All of this makes it very hard to assess how sustainable and robust supply chains are. Therefore, the vision for this project was to create something that could tell us, for a range of different impact metrics, what the effects of commodity consumption by a given country, territory or region are in environments across the globe, to understand where those impacts are taking place and which commodities are driving them. The importance of shifting to patterns of sustainable consumption and production is referenced within a number of multilateral environmental agreements. For example, SDG Goal 12 encourages more sustainable consumption and production patterns through various measures, including specific policies and international agreements on the management of materials that are toxic to the environment. And more recently, the CBD's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework has a target which focuses solely on sustainable consumption. And this is, of course, the main reason we're all here today. So here is Target 16 in full. Its tagline, sustainable consumption choices are enabled, including halving food waste, captures the key focus. Note that this target highlights the need to improve access to relevant and accurate information and alternatives to unsustainable consumption choices to ensure that people are encouraged and enabled to make sustainable consumption choices. It therefore recognises that we need to understand and disentangle the complex problem of unsustainable consumption in order to address it. The Target 16 has no headline indicator, but it does have 4 component indicators. Those are the Food Waste Index, which provides estimates of total food waste at retail and consumer level. The material footprint, an estimate of the total tonnes of material extracted or produced to support consumption. The Global Environmental Impacts of Consumption Indicator, which is what we're going to be telling you more about today. And lastly, the ecological footprint, which provides an estimate of how much regeneration would be required to produce natural resources that are consumed and to absorb waste that is produced. So the focus of today's webinar is the Global Environmental Impacts of Consumption, or the GEEC indicator. GEEC is a modelling tool which estimates deforestation, biodiversity loss and other environmental impacts driven by consumption in a given country, territory or region, mapped to those countries and territories where the impacts are taking place. It's able to capture the complexities in international trade that I mentioned earlier, so including products being re-exported through multiple countries and commodities embedded within other products such as soy and livestock feed. The best way to use the GEEC indicator and explore what it can do is via the online dashboard, which you can find at www.commodityfootprints.earth. This screenshot of the dashboard gives an example of the kind of thing that the indicator can do. So here you can see how much deforestation is associated with the United Kingdom's consumption in the year 2021. The darker areas show where there's greater deforestation associated with UK consumption. Now, some of you might already be familiar with the indicator and have maybe noticed that this deforestation data looks a little different to how it was previously displayed. And that's because an update to the indicator was published just last month on the 14th of November. And this includes improvements to the methodology and updates to the data sets underlying the indicator. Over the next few slides, I'll walk you through how to use the dashboard and generate charts and data that you're interested in, and I'll flag some of these major changes that came out of the recent update as I go. So on the dashboard, there are several drop-down boxes where you can select different options depending on the data you're interested in. So for example, you can use the Visualize drop-down to select an environmental impact. There are 10 different impact types that you can select from, including several deforestation metrics, green and blue water use and species loss, which are all listed on the right-hand side of this slide. The first update that I want to highlight for this year is that estimates of deforestation impacts are now available for forests worldwide. In the previous release, the indicator only provided estimates for tropical forests, so this has massively increased the geographic scope of these metrics. You can select other options to view the data in different ways. So, for example, you can view the data from a production perspective to estimate the impacts associated with commodity production in a particular country or territory, and to see which countries, territories, and regions' consumption are driving those impacts. If you click on more settings, there are more ways to subset the data you're interested in, for example, by focusing on one or more commodities in particular. And once you've made all your selections, you just click the Update Data button, and different graphs and charts are produced alongside the map that visualize the data you've selected. Here are some examples of what those visualizations look like. On the left, you can see how the amount of deforestation associated with the UK's consumption in 2021 compared to other countries and territories. And on the right, you can see the top commodities associated with that deforestation. The dashboard and data are totally free to use and download, and your national authorities can use the data to report on impacts associated with your consumption under Target 16 of the GBF. This is a way for you to access relevant data that can help inform and enable sustainable consumption choices in your country. There's information about how to use Geek for national reporting on the dashboard's FAQ section, and I've highlighted where you can find this information on this slide. I'll now talk you through some of these instructions and show you the different ways you can use the dashboard depending on the consumption country you're interested in. So the data is designed to be reported on as several separate metrics. The 10 impact types don't combine together to give a single total. So we recommend that you report on a suite of impact types, including deforestation, scarcity weighted water use, and predicted species loss. But you may also wish to report against the full range of other metrics. Another change this year is that there is now far more detailed coverage of consumption countries and territories compared to the previous release. This is because there are now 2 sets of results available based on different consumption model options. One of these consumption models is called ExiaBase, and this has only data for 44 different countries and territories, with those remaining grouped into 5 larger rest of world regions. And ExiaBase has data for every year between 2005 and 2021. The other consumption model is called the Global Trade Analysis Project, or GTAP, which has data for 141 different countries and territories. But currently GTAP only has data for 4 different years, 2007, 2011, 2014 and 2017. So you can use the drop down in the top right hand corner of the dashboard to select the consumption data model, and depending on which one you choose, this will change the options that appear in the drop down to select your country, territory or region. And both of those drop downs I've highlighted on this slide as well. We suggest that if your country shows up when ExiaBase is selected, you use the ExiaBase data model. But if your country doesn't show up in this list, then simply switch the data model drop down to GTAP instead and find your country from the list there. You can also go to these external links, which are given in the FAQ section on the dashboard, so don't worry, you don't have to write these down. And they show you the country, territory and region mapping for each model. In this way, you can identify how your country is included in each model, whether there are data available at the country or territory level, or whether it's grouped into a rest of world region. I'm now going to show you how you'd go about using the indicator in national reporting, with one example of a country that's included in the ExiaBase data and one example of a country that isn't. So first, we're going to imagine that I want to identify deforestation associated with consumption in Canada. You can see in the top right hand corner that I've selected ExiaBase as the data model because Canada does appear in the country and territory list for ExiaBase. And therefore, by selecting this model, I can generate country specific data for each year between 2005 and 2021. I then want to select the impact type that I'm interested in. So here, deforestation, and the consumption country, in this case, Canada. And I want to make sure that I'm looking at commodity consumption, which is the default setting, rather than changing this to production. For the purposes of national reporting, you should just keep everything in the more settings options set as their defaults. And once you've selected the correct settings, you click Update Data to see the data and charts. You can scroll down to the graph entitled Total per Year, and this gives you a visual representation of your national indicator. And that brings me to the final major change in the new release that I'm going to highlight. When using Exiobase as the consumption data model, the dashboard now provides estimates up to 2021, whereas the previous release only provided estimates up to 2018. So we've got far more up-to-date data available now. So here in this graph, we can see the deforestation associated with Canada's consumption for each year between 2005 and 2021. You can also click on data at the bottom right of this graph to download the summary data that make up the national indicator results. And that's it. With a couple more clicks, you can repeat the same process for different impact types that you're interested in. So moving on to another example, this time imagining that I want to identify predicted species loss associated with consumption in New Zealand. So this time I've selected GTAP as the data model. And this is because New Zealand is not one of the countries and territories included in the Exiobase data. In Exiobase, it's grouped into a rest of world region that's called Asia and Pacific. But New Zealand is one of the countries and territories in the GTAP data. So by using GTAP as the underlying data model, we can get country-specific consumption data associated with New Zealand's consumption by selecting the GTAP model. And now it's the same process as before. I've selected the appropriate data model. I've selected the impact type of interest and the consumption country, and I have selected commodity consumption rather than production. I'm not going to change anything in more settings. I'll keep those as their defaults, and then I click Update Data to see the data and charts. I scroll down to the total per year graph, which shows the species loss associated with New Zealand's consumption for the years 2007, 11, 14 and 17. And I click on data to download the summary data. And again, that's it. You can just repeat this process for the other impact types that you're interested in. Now, while 96.4% of the world's population is mapped to the country or territory level in GTAP, unfortunately, we still don't have data at this scale for all countries and territories. So in some cases, countries will have to rely on regional estimates instead as a proxy. And I want to look at one of these cases now. I'm using the example of Burundi, which is grouped into a rest of world region in both of the consumption models. But those regions do cover different geographic areas, with the GTAP region including several countries in Eastern Africa and the Exiobase region covering a greater number of countries across most of the African continent. So therefore, I'm going to select GTAP as the model to use here because it still provides a greater geographic resolution than the Exiobase data model. Everything is exactly before. I make all my selections, and this time I want to see the scarcity weighted blue water impacts associated with commodity consumption in the rest of Eastern Africa region. I click Update Data, and then I scroll down to the total per year data and graph. So the final thing that I want to flag about the different ways to use this data for national reporting is that if your country has territories, then it's important to check how these are treated in the consumption data model you're using. And you can do this again by looking at the country and territory mapping, which are available on these links in our dashboard FAQ section. So by doing this, you might see that a territory of your country is not included in the consumption data for that country, but instead is included as a separate territory. So If this is the case, you should repeat the process of generating the graph and downloading the data for the territory you're interested in, and then you can aggregate the territory data with the rest of your country's data to include those consumption impacts associated with the territory as well. So that's all I'm going to say on using the data for national reporting. After doing so, you might want to explore more specific impacts, such as focusing on particular commodities or production countries to identify which are contributing most to your national values. This can help better inform discussions around targeting solutions. And you can do that by clicking on more settings. So here, for example, I have specified that I want to view deforestation associated with the UK's consumption of soya beans produced in Brazil. Before I finish, I'd just like to flag that we're continually looking for ways to improve the dashboard. In particular, we are likely to update the presentation of the 2 model options on the dashboard a little in the next few weeks. Obviously, having these 2 model options is very new, and we're exploring ways to display and explain these more intuitively. So the way this looks may change a little in future, but the data and functionality will remain the same. If after you've had a chance to look at the dashboard yourself, you've got any feedback on this or on any aspect of how to improve the usability of the dashboard, please do get in touch with us via email at ukglobalimpacts@jncc.gov.uk. And a reminder that you can find the dashboard at commodityfootprints.earth, where there's also lots of supporting information. All the things that I've talked through today is all on the dashboard, and there are further useful links too. So now I'll hand over to Maddie, who's going to give you a little more detail on the methods behind the indicator.
Thanks, Ellie. Now, I won't go into too much detail on the methods behind the indicator here, but as a fairly brief overview, the 2 things that you need are that you need data on to be able to get these kinds of outputs are information on the trade of commodities, broken down by commodity type and country of origin. So what am I consuming and where is it coming from? And then you need to be able to link the production of that commodity in that location with data about the impacts on the environment that this production causes. Knowing the original production country is important, as for many commodities, that's where most of the environmental impact in production of a product takes place. To answer the first of these 2 questions, we've used a modified form of multi-regional input-output, or MRAO modelling, developed by the University of York, whereby MRAO trade data are hybridised with physical production data from the FAO. MRAO is an economic tool that takes data on the monetary flow of goods between countries and between sectors within countries. The integration of physical FAO data from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations allows for a better resolution to be reached, more countries and territories from a production perspective, and more commodities such as palm oil or soy, rather than sectors such as oilseeds or hospitality. This modelling approach has advantages over conventional bilateral trade data in that it can better capture complexities within international trade. For example, it accounts for cases where commodities are embedded within other products as an ingredient or an input, such as soy and livestock feed, and also for cases where commodities are re-exported through multiple countries before the point of consumption. This hybridized modelling framework is known as IOTA. Once we have data estimating what's been traded where, we can then combine this with international data sets on the impacts of commodity production. For example, for the deforestation metric, we have used data from Singh and Persson 2023, which is follow-on work from the Pendra et al. Dataset, estimating the deforestation driven by each type of commodity within each country of the world. We can then use proportional attribution to assign these impacts to consuming countries. For example, if we consume 10% of a particular commodity from a particular country compared to the total of what's being produced in that country, we can assume that we're associated with 10% of the impacts estimated to be taking place in that country due to the production of that commodity. The same concept is applied to the other metrics, for example, using the Chowdhury and Caston dataset for one biodiversity metric, data from MapSpam, which is a modelled global dataset providing information on which crops are grown where, alongside species richness information from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and BirdLife International for the other biodiversity metric, and data from the Water Footprint Network and Boulay et al. To calculate the water metrics. If you're interested in understanding more detail about the methods behind the indicator, then I'd recommend taking a look at the recording of Monday's webinar, which was focused on the methods and technical detail. Or you could also read through the technical documentation, which is linked to in the methodology section of the dashboard. So something that's important to understand about the indicator is that it's based on modelling, and therefore there are things that it can and can't do. So what we're talking about here is the modelled most likely trade flows based on both reported data, but also filling gaps with logical and proportion-based assumptions. It's not a tool that's aiming to trace trade flows exactly, because publicly available data to be able to do that don't currently exist. The model can be used to estimate impacts such as deforestation at the country or territory scale, but it can't currently tell you information at a more localized scale within that country or territory, although we are scoping out ways to improve this and hope to be able to add some subnational data in next year's release. However, national reporting is not the only thing that this data can be used for. Whilst it's really useful in that context as a time series indicator showing across the broad context of everything going on in this space, what's the scale of the impact overall, and are there trends for any given country, territory, or region throughout time? Are they going up or down? But where I think it adds the most value, and something that's quite novel about the indicator, is its ability to break the data down by the producer countries in which the impacts are taking place, and the commodities that the impacts are associated with. Earlier, Ellie demonstrated how you can do this by clicking on more settings on the dashboard. This can help us to identify hotspots of impact, the geographies or commodities where it would be most effective to target action. This can be quite powerful in terms of actually designing solutions in partnership with the relevant country or industry. As a consumer, it's in our interests to not be associated with driving this impact. And as a producer, it's in our interests to ensure that production in our country is sustainable so that we're able to keep producing and supporting our economy into the future without degrading our ecosystem services. So if looking for where to target efforts, for example, if you've got funding to support sustainable production practices or opportunities to include the need for sustainable consumption within multilateral environmental agreements or trade agreements, the indicator could be used to show the countries or territories that would make the biggest difference if exploring partnership-based solutions together. And similarly, you can also use it to hotspot which commodities we consume that are associated with the highest impacts. So if, for example, designing a solution that can't include everything in scope for a particular intervention, you could check the indicator to determine which commodities should be prioritised and focused on first. And again, this also makes it possible to identify collaboration opportunities with specific industries who will have an interest in ensuring the sustainability of their supply for the long term, might have concerns about ensuring green practices in their supply chains from a customer interest or investor interest perspective, and will want to stay ahead of any potential legislation. We'd like you to keep in mind that it's designed to help us work together globally and to find solutions that benefit everyone. It's in no way about pointing the finger or rights or wrongs, but rather about opening dialogue and spotting opportunities to collaborate. We're currently partway through a 3-year work plan to continue developing and improving the indicator. The indicator is already in a fully usable state, but we're continuing to work on further expanding the scope and improving the accuracy and resolution of the data beyond its current state. We've already scoped the possibility of adding metals and mining data, which is increasingly important with the rise of the high-tech economy, electric vehicles and the like. And we're due to release some initial data on this later this financial year, but separately to the main data release due to its more experimental nature. We're also looking at the potential to incorporate data on marine and aquaculture commodities. As well as this, we're looking to develop additional impact metrics related to more developed agricultural systems and agricultural intensity, such as the impacts of fertilizer use. As most of the current metrics, for example those related to deforestation, focus on impacts in expanding agricultural frontiers rather than existing agricultural land. As well as this, we're doing some intercomparison work, for example, comparing how different data inputs affect model results to help us better understand and quantify uncertainty. We're looking at integrating finer scale resolution trade data into the model. We'll be running a consultation about interpretation and usefulness of the indicator and integrating knowledge from other relevant projects and research programs such as the Trade Hub, particularly on potential improved biodiversity metrics. We'll also be publishing updated data annually each autumn. So just to highlight again that this continued development work does not affect the usability of the indicator in the meantime. The data can be reported on it already. There just might be more data that are possible to report on in future too. So as Ellie mentioned at the beginning, the GEEK indicator wasn't the only one included within the Global Biodiversity Framework as a component indicator for Target 16. The food waste index, the material footprint, and the ecological footprint were all included too. So you're probably wondering what the differences are and how they all compare to each other. Each of these metrics is aiming to answer a different question and contribute to the evidence base in different ways that make them best suited to different use cases. For example, the food waste index is looking at how much food waste is produced by retailers and consumers, which is important because waste is an unnecessary aspect of consumption. So cuts in waste could lead to cuts in the overall amount consumed and therefore reductions in associated impacts. Meanwhile, the material footprint is looking at how much mass is extracted or produced to support consumption through a country's supply chains. And this is important because total mass can be used as a crude proxy for overall pressures and impacts on the environment due to consumption. In contrast, the ecological footprint is looking at how much of the regenerative capacity of the biosphere is occupied by human demand. So how much land area is needed to produce what a country is consuming and to absorb the carbon emitted in the supply chains. And that's important because planetary resources are finite. So if we're consuming more than can be regenerated, that's not sustainable into the future. Results compared to an ecological threshold, providing context rather than just an absolute value. And as you know, the GEEK indicator is looking at specific impact types, so estimating specifically the biodiversity loss, the water impacts, the deforestation, etc., that take place as a result of consumption. And this is important because biodiversity loss, water, and deforestation are key aspects of environmental sustainability. So depending on the use case that you're interested in, you'd likely pick a different indicator to look at. If you want to understand waste, then obviously the most appropriate to use would be the food waste index. If you want something that's easy to visualize, the ecological footprint can represent results in the form of planetary boundaries, how many Earths we'd need to support consumption. And if you're interested in biodiversity specifically, or in that detailed breakdown to be able to target actions and inform solutions, as well as just report on a national total, then the GEEK indicator would be most appropriate for your needs. Each indicator is going to be sensitive as well to different types of intervention. For example, the material and ecological footprints are going to be very sensitive to reductions in the amount of goods that are consumed, whereas the GEEK indicator will have greater sensitivity than the others to the impacts of production practices in the country of origin and to changes in sourcing patterns. These tables are taken from a piece of work that we did for Welsh Government, comparing different consumption-based metrics that are available, and we'll drop the link in the chat so you can take a look at the rest of it after the session if you're interested in finding out more. So I think overall, they're all quite complementary to each other and are each trying to answer a slightly different question, all of which are relevant if you're trying to understand something as big and complicated as consumption. An analogy I quite like is that you wouldn't expect a plumber to turn up at your house with only a spanner and expect to be able to fix everything you want them to with just this one tool. And similarly, we need multiple tools to measure and understand different aspects of this problem. So if you're trying to decide which of these you should report on, given that they're all optional, I would suggest that having all of them would be useful if possible. The key advantage of the GEEK indicator, though, is the more granular breakdown by geography and commodity, which helps when planning solutions rather than only using it as a reporting tool, and the fact that it specifically includes biodiversity impacts in the suite of data presented. I'll just finish by thanking you all for listening and reiterating that if anyone would like to speak to us directly about using the data, either in a GBF reporting context or for any other use case, then please don't hesitate to get in contact. We'd love to hear from you and help out. And with that, I'll pass back to Nikki.
Great, thank you so much, Maddie and Ellie, for that great introduction to the indicator. So we now have roughly 15-20 minutes to answer any of your questions that are in the Q&A box. Our partners at SEI are also on the call, so we might direct some of the more technical questions to them because they are the technical gurus. So yeah, please do continue to post your questions in the Q&A if anything else springs to mind while we are chatting. And I see that there's one in the Q&A so far, so I'll just ask that, and I think it could probably be directed at anyone at JNCC or SEI, so a bit of a free fall. But yeah, this person wants to ask, does it work or will it work to see the global footprint for another country such as Colombia?
Yes, it will. So I think this might have been asked kind of earlier on in the presentation before Ellie had gone into some of the how to do it for other countries around the world. So there is data for Colombia. I think I'm right in saying that Colombia is one that the data would be under the GTAP model rather than the Exia-based model. So you wouldn't get data on that full time series, but you do have data.
Yeah, thanks, Maddie. I think that's correct. I think in the Exia-based version, it's aggregated in the rest of world America region. So yeah, you're correct in saying it's part of the GTAP version.
Just to add on that, sorry, that that's very much when you're thinking of it from a consumption side. But if you're interested in any country from a production end, regardless of which MRIO you've chosen, those production end metrics, so the impacts associated with production of different commodities in the country, and also then the downstream supply chains associated with that production, can be looked at for any country or territory in the world pretty much, because that's coming from a different data set, so you're not constrained by the MRIO. So that can be done for Colombia using either data set.
Awesome, thanks so much, Simon. Yeah, I hope that fully answers that question. I think it does. Another question in the chat from Sally Taylor, saying that she's really interested to see how this tool could support prioritization for sustainable procurement actions, and whether you've heard of a tool called EcoInvent, and whether this tool, the GEEK indicator, maybe links to the same data, or are they completely different? Not sure if either of you have heard of EcoInvent, and whether it could, the GEEK could support prioritization for sustainable procurement actions. If any of you could speak to that.
I can maybe take that one. Hi everybody. So yeah, just firstly on EcoInvent. So EcoInvent is a repository ultimately of environmental impact factors that is typically used by the life cycle assessment community, and that repository collates from various different sources estimates of impacts across a number of different environmental domains for essentially different products, so different processed and raw materials. I would say they are relatively different in the sense that the methodologies behind the collation of that data is quite different. So what typically would happen with an LCA type study is that there would be an analysis of a particular supply chain, and then as part of that analysis, that life cycle assessment process, characterization factors would be developed which try and estimate those impacts, and then those then put into this repository, so that if another organization is looking at a similar supply chain, they can say, well, that's the sort of typical impact factor that might be associated with that product. What would typically happen with those sorts of data sets, however, is that you would be looking at quite specific details, but also often very general one-off snapshots. This is a factor for the global production of coal, and it's for the year 2005, and those are typically fairly static, although it does vary. One of the things that obviously the geek indicator does is take the complexity of trying to understand the individual supply chain out of the equation. So we are doing the mapping of how products reach consumption and what the overall responsibility is for you, rather than having to apply these factors in a sort of detailed case study based approach. And also we do this time series of those factors are adjusting over time when new information on production systems and land use change and so on come in. In terms of supporting sustainable procurement actions in general, I think it rather depends what the level of analysis that's required is. I would say that tools like Geek are very useful for doing that first cut. So saying, okay, well, of all the products that we're sourcing, these are the sorts of materials that those are associated with, and these are the particular risks and impacts that we might be experiencing in those supply chains, and we can start to identify where in the world some of those impacts might be highest. If you're then moving towards saying, okay, well, we're going to focus on our procurement of beef, for example, you're going to need more detail on the specific suppliers, their sustainability commitments, specific uses of those materials, etc., to get a big picture of the system. But I think as a first cut, it can be a useful tool.
Awesome, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I see in the Q&A a couple people also reiterating that it is a powerful tool, and looking forward to and the forward-looking roadmap looks very promising. So that's great to hear. Yeah, the next question links a little bit to carbon emissions and whether the carbon emissions component of Geek could be disaggregated from the other impacts, such as water biodiversity, or probably water/biodiversity. Yeah, Maddie, do you want to answer that one?
Yep, so it's presented in a disaggregated way already. We have different results for each of the different impact metrics that are available. So unlike some of the other indicators under the same target, for example, the ecological footprint does aggregate together the carbon emissions with other land use impact types. In the Geek indicator, they're disaggregated. Now, the carbon component in the Geek indicator is only focusing on carbon emissions from associated with deforestation, so the land use change based emissions, rather than the direct emissions from supply chains, like the petrol you'd be using in your tractor and emissions from that, or transport, or that kind of thing. The direct emissions are already we already have we already had a UK carbon footprint when we were initially developing this, so we didn't include those within this. And carbon, one of the advantages of the Geek indicator is its ability to be kind of spatially explicit. So that's obviously something that's very important for the carbon emissions from land use change side of things. You're going to have very different emissions if that's happening in different places, whereas that's less so the case for the direct emissions, which can be calculated using a kind of more aggregated way of doing things in the first place. Anybody want to add to that?
It's all good from my side.
It sounds like you answered that really well. Thanks, Maddie. Yeah, another question coming in broadly about how this sort of information supports trade agreements and what kind of support and advice might be given to supply chain actors, etc. I think Chris might be best positioned to answer this.
Yes, and maybe Maddie can can say something about the way in which we use the indicator on the UK level to sort of work alongside the policy formulation and governance of these sorts of systems. I think key thing to say here is that this is obviously just one piece of information, and the hope is that when organisations and governments start to take note of the sort of information that these sorts of tools can provide, then it provides new evidence that can be used in the context of developing trade agreements and particularly improving environmental provisions within those trade agreements over time. I think it's always going to be the case with this sort of information that it's not representative necessarily of all of the complexity that goes on in terms of these supply chains and the environmental credentials or otherwise of individual specific trades. So we need to be cautious about this data when negotiating these sorts of things, but as a helpful starting point in saying, okay, well, these are the big issues that we think are associated with these trade routes. These are the priority areas where we could put some attention and come to some agreement on environmental protection provisions. I think it's a useful starting point. In terms of the degree at which these things are taken up in trade agreements at the moment, obviously, actually the environmental provisions typically are relatively cursory and lacking. So this sort of information can be useful in hopefully strengthening consideration of those issues within trade and other policies. In terms of risks and opportunity for the private sector in that context, I think the key thing for me here is that these sorts of tools should not be used for making decisions about blacklisting or shifting sourcing from one point of production to another, unless there has been sufficient dialogue on the ground in producing regions about what solutions there are for any challenges that have been identified. And that dialogue and bringing in the producer perspectives and the supply chain perspectives as part of that dialogue is something that I think is an obvious next step for when doing an assessment with these sorts of indicators. It's about identifying priorities and then acting on those priorities to share experiences and to share practices and so on. Maddie, I don't know if you've got anything to add on that.
I guess not much. I guess just to add that it's saying, can we give a heads up to the private sector? So I guess just to highlight that all of the data is completely openly available. So a private sector actor could access that in exactly the same way as a government or anyone else could. So yeah.
Thanks, Maddie, and really good points, Chris. Yeah, I think we're going to be rolling out quite a bit of stakeholder engagement with various actors in the near future. So yeah, hopefully it'll be used by a bit more widely in future. Yeah, so there's, I think within Sally's thread in the chat, there was another question I didn't really ask, and that was whether there might be an opportunity to build in wider sustainability data into the tool, for example, modern slavery. Not sure if either of you have thought about that and can speak to that. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, fundamentally in a kind of methodological sense, basically anything that we have information on linked to production can be included as an indicator. So that could be additional environmental metrics, very much in the kind of form of the ones we've got, or it could be something quite different, such as economic sustainability, human welfare, slavery, etc., etc. Where there is kind of a big, so first of all, so yes, it's possible, and it is also something we're kind of quite keen to do and have been in sort of active discussions about for quite some time now, trying to work out how this might be done. I think one thing I will flag is that it's typically, I think, quite a bit more challenging. You can't point a satellite at the Earth to gather data on kind of human work conditions and the like, and it's much harder to kind of obtain such information in a systematic way at the kind of global scale that we're presenting as the metrics we currently include. Now, that's not to say that it's not an option and we won't be taking it forward. It's more we need to work out, sorry, my cat's making herself, no, we need to work out the appropriate way to include that in a way that it's complementary and sort of adds to what's already there. And it might be that it needs to be done in quite a different way, and perhaps it's best not packaged up directly as a part of this, but actually as some kind of complementary or side component of the indicator.
Thanks so much, Simon. If yeah, anyone else wants to add to that? Mandy's shaking her head. Chris is on mute, shaking his head. Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. Yeah, I think that definitely covers that. Yeah, probably take another 2 or 3 questions because I realize we're getting a bit closer to 12:30. But yeah, this next question is asking about whether there are best practice examples of how this is used, or if not yet used, could be used in systems change or collective intelligence approach for policy development.
So yeah, I
Go for
think
it, Maddie.
obviously it's still a fairly new tool. It's only been published for a couple of years, and we've been kind of adding to it each year, so it was in a fairly basic format the first year. So I think it definitely hasn't yet reached as many people as it could do in terms of use cases. So just to reiterate again, if anybody on the call has particular use cases that you'd be interested in using it for, we would be really keen for you to get in touch and discuss those with us. I guess one example of where it's been used already is in the consultation document around the UK's due diligence legislation. So this is legislation that's being proposed on the ensuring that commodities imported to the UK by larger businesses don't have illegal deforestation in their supply chains. So in the consultation document around that, it was quoted as one of several other data sources on which commodities should come in scope for that legislation. But I guess that's only touching the tip of the iceberg of what the kinds of things that it could do. So I think I listed some of them out on the slide earlier, but I think it reaches across a really wide range of different policy areas, and yeah, we'd be really keen to get in contact with anyone who has kind of concrete ideas around how to use it. We've also been doing a separate piece of work within JNCC on the policy interventions that have been used to improve the sustainability of consumption, either elsewhere or suggested in the literature, and whether there's evidence around kind of how they work. So I guess that's moving away from the indicator specifically and more into the kind of wider area of what next. But we can also pop the link for that into the chat if that's of interest.
Great, thanks so much, Maddie. Yeah, I don't see anything else coming in the Q&A. So I think I might just wrap up there. And if anyone else has further questions or comments, yeah, please do get in touch with us. On the next slide, Maddie will show the contact details for JNCC, which is the UK Global Impacts at jncc.gov.uk. Maddie, if you could just click next so that everyone has sight of that. Yeah, so we have recorded this webinar as well as the other 2 webinars that took place earlier this week, and we'll be sending those around to everyone who registered afterwards in case you'd like to refer back or share amongst your colleagues. And yeah, lastly, just a final thank you to Maddie and Ellie for the engaging talk, and to Chris West and Simon Croft for joining us to answer some of the technical questions. Yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did, and thank you so much for your questions and comments and being here today. Thank you so much. I will end it there.